In part 3, in the time of Jonah, we dealt with an uncertainty of 45 years. In part 4, in the time of Moses, we find ourselves embroiled in a debate that involves centuries, which is huge. Time matters. It's foundational. Time is the foundation for history, and history is the foundation for everything cultural. The Exodus is key to the Old Testament, and yet there is no consensus over who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Was it Ramesses II, Ramesses III, Amenhotep II, or Dudimose? Was the Exodus spectacular? Was it exaggerated? Or was it just made up? I'll show you the possible choices. You can decide for yourself. You can drive through any city in the United States and encounter churches like this one. We expect to find churches in every major neighborhood, but they're not all the same. They may look the same on the outside, but have different degrees of faith on the inside. Some believe strongly and some don't. I say this because most people don't realize how important a strong faith is to our society. A church's faith comes from its pastors and leaders who themselves learn from scholars who interpret history. To understand why churches differ, we need to look at the scholars who interpret history. What do the scholars say? Believe it or not, most religious higher education is secular in nature. In fact, many pastors were educated in the religious departments of secular colleges. Courses in history, for instance, deal with the facts of history more than miracles and faith. Scholars who are experts in their fields have to be certain about what they affirm, so they tend to be skeptical about everything. That is especially true about the Exodus. To understand what pastors are being told by scholars, we need to know the most popular views being taught today. We can find those views listed in a simple book in the Counterpoints series called 5 Views on the Exodus. The 5 views on the Exodus are 5 schools of thought that are behind most Judeo-Christian belief systems in the world today. Let me summarize them. Scott Stripling represents the most conservative viewpoint. Following the Bible, Stripling calculates the date of the Exodus to be 1446 BC, which falls during the reign of Amenhotep II in Egypt. Like most others, he does not question the Egyptian timeline. It takes a lot for one expert to question another expert in a different field, so he plays it safe. Stripling also believes that as few as 12,000 Israelites were involved in the Exodus, not 2 million. James Hoffmeyer uses the city of Ramses in Exodus 1:11 to link the Exodus to Ramses II and considers that biblical dating is of secondary importance. He also finds it important to say that the Israelites probably only crossed a hypothetical marshland called the Sea of Reeds, not what we know as the Red Sea. Peter Feynman proposes that a Hyksos group left Egypt during the reign of Ramses II. They created the nation of Israel and wrote the Bible at that time. His reconstruction does not need for God to exist. Gary Rensburg points to an influx of inhabitants in the hills of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age, which corresponds to Ramses III. Egypt was weakened by the invasion of the Sea People at this time, making it easier for Israel to escape. Ronald Hendel disagrees with inerrancy and the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. He proposes that the Exodus was a cultural memory. It was a myth and not an historical event. Out of the 5 views on the Exodus, only one holds that the Bible is accurate when it comes to dates. That one is held by Stripling, and even he believes that the Bible is wrong about how many Israelites came out of Egypt. He believes there were as few as 12,000 rather than 2 million. These scholars give a good indication of the current trend away from the historical and verbal credibility of the Bible. The key verse on dating the Exodus is 1 Kings 6:1. It says that it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of Egypt that Solomon began to build the temple. That's very precise and gives a precise date for the Exodus of 1446 BC or 1491 BC according to Jones. Other verses confirm the century but not the year. It's easy to dismiss the Bible, but we can suppose for a moment that the Bible is historically true and look for an event in history that matches the narrative. Before we look for the Exodus in history, we need to know what we're looking for. Just as the Bible gives a precise date for the Exodus, it also gives a precise description of the events that transpired. Let's establish 4 clearly stated facts from the Bible about the Exodus. These will be the criteria we use to test the possible time periods and the candidates for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. The first clear fact from the Bible is that millions were affected by the Exodus. This comes from Exodus 12:37 that mentions 600,000 Israelite men of fighting age. That would add up to about 2 million in all. Stripling, Hoffmeyer, and Roll believe that there must have been a spelling error and that they meant to write 600 groups of men, not 600,000 men. A migration of millions would have really been a miracle, and that would be hard to miss. On the Egyptian side, the firstborn in every family died. It could have been both parents as well as the child. Every family with children was affected. Whatever the family size, that would represent a significant slice of the population, maybe a third. Egyptian was greatly diminished. Pharaoh and his army were gone. 600 chosen chariots are mentioned, which would have been his elite bodyguard. The number of regular chariots, horsemen, and foot soldiers would have been innumerable. The implied size of the army is huge. The strongest workers of the 2/3 of the population that remained were suddenly gone. The second fact regards the economy, which is the ability to provide for the daily needs of the people. The means of production was gone. All the livestock that were in the open field were killed. That included horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks. All the trees and plants in the open fields were struck down. All the fields of flax and barley were destroyed, and the wheat and rye would not be ready for some time. Locusts ravaged all the remaining crops and trees in the entire country of Egypt. Nothing green remained. Egypt was destroyed, and it would take years to rebuild. The third fact is the loss of assets. Jewelry was about all that the Egyptians had left. The Israelites asked the Egyptians to loan them their gold and silver jewelry, and they did not hesitate to give it to them. This is unheard of, but Moses was considered a great man by Pharaoh's officials, who bowed down to Moses when they begged him to leave Egypt. All the Egyptians had great respect for the Israelites. The Egyptians were afraid that if the Israelites stayed any longer, they would all be dead. Israel plundered Egypt without any effort. Israel walked away with the wealth of Egypt. Egypt's military represented the strongest and hardest working men in the country. It was wiped out. The only number given is of 600 elite chariots. This would have been Pharaoh's personal bodyguard. Besides that, there were all the chariots of Egypt, which would have been a much larger number, perhaps in the thousands. Then there were Pharaoh's horsemen. They were cheaper, so they would have been in the thousands. Then there were the foot soldiers, which would have numbered more than the horsemen. They all died. What about Pharaoh himself? Exodus 14:6 says that he was definitely in the Red Sea. Exodus 15:19 in the King James says, For the horse of Pharaoh went in with his chariots and with his horsemen into the sea, because the horse is singular in the Hebrew. Other versions say horses. In any case, the horses and chariots were gone. Scholars who say that Pharaoh didn't die in the Red Sea have a hard time explaining how he could have been the lone survivor and walked all the way back to Egypt on foot. That's pulling at straws. Now that we have established 4 clearly stated facts from the Bible, let's use them to test the time periods of the 3 proposed pharaohs. That would be Ramesses II, Ramesses III, and Amenhotep II. Keep in mind that at this time we are comparing biblical dates to conventional Egyptian dates, since the scholars all trust the conventional dating of Egypt. Ramesses II in the 19th dynasty was selected by Hofmeyr and Feynman, as well as by many Hollywood movie makers, because Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built the city of Ramses. But what seems an obvious association between a city and a pharaoh may not be true. What we do see is that Ramses II was the greatest and most powerful pharaoh of the 19th century. He waged 15 military campaigns which he won or withdrew from. His army was never wiped out during his 66 years of reign. He didn't die in the Red Sea because his mummy has been found in the largest tomb of the Valley of the Kings. Pretty impressive. Besides that, the next king, Merneptah, fought against Israel, which wouldn't have allowed enough time for the nation to be established after the wandering in the desert for 40 years. There is no destruction of the economy, wealth, military, and government that affected millions across all of Egypt and Canaan. Ramses II doesn't fit the pattern. Ramses III in the 20th dynasty was selected by Rensburg. He is known as the warrior pharaoh. When other nations were being destroyed by the sea people, Ramses III fought them off and saved Egypt. He was assassinated and then buried in one of the largest tombs. He didn't die in the Red Sea, and the nation was powerful enough and wealthy enough to build him a very large tomb. We don't see a destruction of the economy, wealth, military, and government that affected millions across all of Egypt and Canaan. Ramses III doesn't fit the pattern. To top it off, the Merneptah stela shows that Israel already existed as a nation a century before Ramses III. Finally, Amenhotep II in the 15th century was selected by Stripling. He was not as militarily aggressive as his father. He only led 2 campaigns. He enlarged temples all over Egypt. He adopted many Canaanite gods. His reign was otherwise uneventful. There was no destruction of the economy, wealth, military, and government that affected millions across all of Egypt and Canaan. Amenhotep II doesn't fit the pattern. Nevertheless, he fits the classical date for the Exodus, so a number of conservative Christians are trying to prop him up as proof of the Exodus. There has been an attempt among evangelicals to prop up Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Amenhotep II seems better than Ramses II. Among the most conservative Christians doing this is found the archaeologist organization Associates for Biblical Research, notably the archaeologist Douglas Petrovich. What surprises me is that the strong creationist group Creation Ministries International would take a strong stand against revising Egyptian history. 3 of their writers, Gary Bates, Rob Carter, and Gavin Cox, wrote a book, Tour of Egypt, in which they promote Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I also saw a video with Frank Turek in Egypt promoting Amenhotep II. Why would they accept Egyptian dating without question? That boggles my mind, but I can think of a few reasons. First, They don't want to oppose mainstream Egyptologists. They have already taken on evolution, so it would take more resources to open a new front against the firmly entrenched dating of Egypt. Secondly, I think they want to avoid being associated with the new chronology movement that never won acceptance in England. Personally, I'm not surprised that England would reject it, but I am surprised that Christians in the U.S. are not willing to fight for a good cause that at least deserves hearing. Thirdly, churches are begging for simple proofs of the Bible and of the Exodus. It's easier to give a simple explanation than a complicated one. Unfortunately, unfounded claims can do a lot of damage. The first argument they use is that the king before Amenhotep II, who was Thutmose III, reigned for over 40 years, and Moses was in exile for 40 years. That seems to make sense, but it's a weak argument because it doesn't really eliminate others. Secondly, Amenhotep II was not a firstborn son, or else he would have died in the 10th plague. At least that doesn't eliminate him. Also, his mummy has some kind of bumps on the skin which could have come from a plague of boils. Fourthly, Hatshepsut, who was Amenhotep II's step-grandmother, became queen, but had her monuments defaced. This could have been because she was the queen who raised Moses, but this is sheer speculation. The first problem is that Moses returned from Midian after 40 years because, quote, all the men were dead who sought his life. He wasn't just the Pharaoh who needed to die. Then, many pharaohs were not firstborn, so that doesn't really identify anyone. Thirdly, the pharaoh most likely died in the Red Sea, so the fact that we found his mummy should eliminate him. Lastly, most people think that Hatshepsut's monuments were effaced because she was a woman and not because she raised Moses. The arguments are weak, and the New Kingdom doesn't match the Bible. All our tests failed when we chose to believe the Bible to be correct and also Egyptian dating to be correct. That doesn't work. Either the Bible is wrong or Egyptian history is wrong. Our next test is to assume that the Bible is correct and Egyptian history is wrong. Egyptian dates need to be revised. We began to examine this position in part 2, where we introduced the new chronology movement. A number of scholars have been working for the last 80 years at revising the Egyptian Third Intermediate Period because it has so many problems. The arguments for revising are compelling. Most people recognize the problems but disagree on how much it needs revising. David Rohl suggests 350 years, others less. The 21st and 26th dynasty shown on top may have operated at the same time, but in different parts of Egypt. We have no proof that one came before the other. If the 21st and 22nd dynasties overlap, then the dates for Egypt change by 220 to 350 years. The New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom would shift. More importantly, the Exodus date of 1446 or 1491 BC would fall at the end of the Middle Kingdom and not in the New Kingdom, which makes much more sense. Using David Rohl's dates, the biblical date for the Exodus falls at the exact time when the Middle Kingdom of Egypt was destroyed by unknown causes. Let me draw you a picture. We saw that the Exodus doesn't fit during the strong New Kingdom shown at the right. It doesn't fit during the strong Middle Kingdom either on the left. The intermediate period is shown in white in the middle. Our date for the Exodus falls at the end of the Middle Kingdom when Egypt was destroyed. There was a huge vacuum that lasted at least 232 years. The absence of Egyptian leadership was so drastic that Canaanites moved in and took over without any resistance. millions were affected, which satisfies our first test. Manetho wrote this, Dudimose, he names the Pharaoh. In his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others." End quote. The time and extent of the Exodus is described in writing by the Egyptians themselves. While Manetho wrote in the 3rd century BC as an historian, one Egyptian scribe named Ipuwer wrote during the Middle Kingdom as an eyewitness of the Exodus. He wrote, quote, "Gone is the grain of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Upper Egypt has become a wasteland. Grain is lacking on every side. The storehouse is bare. Women say, 'Oh, that we had something to eat.'" End quote. He wrote during the Middle Kingdom as he witnessed the destruction of the Egyptian economy. There's no way to measure the wealth taken by Israel because the Hyksos came later and also plundered the Egyptians, making slaves of many of them. Ipuwer, however, gives an eyewitness account of the Israelites. He wrote, quote, "The slave takes what he finds. What belongs to the palace has been stripped. Gold, lapis lazuli, silver, and turquoise are strung on the necks of female slaves. See how the poor of the land have become rich, whilst the man of property is a pauper." End quote. He could not have been speaking of the plundering by the Hyksos because the Hyksos were not slaves. The Israelites were. We would not expect scribes and monuments to document the fall of Egypt if the government is gone. Nothing like this happened in the New Kingdom. The departure of the Israelites, the loss of the army, and the destruction of the economy left a vacuum that was filled by Semites from the Levant. David Rohl has a fascinating study on these kings. He links the first kings to the Amalekites that Joshua and the 12 spies encountered and that Caleb fought 40 years later in the Promised Land. These were the lesser Hyksos of the 14th dynasty, which makes a lot of sense. There is no record of a battle because no army was left. Then a century later, Amalekites from as far north as Syria were led by Salitis to seize Memphis and establish the 17th dynasty. Pestilence and famine continued to leave the land weak for centuries. This was God's punishment. So, what have you decided? Is Egyptian history correct and the Bible a myth? Or can we consider questioning mainstream scholarship? The Bible says that Egypt was destroyed. Academics are very reluctant to open the door to even discuss a supernatural God. Christians should not only be open to believing in miracles, but also in pressing scholars to talk about God. God who is present in history, God who judged Egypt and Canaan and established Israel in the Promised Land forever. Don't let anyone say that the mighty miracles of God like the Exodus are not possible, because we can see the hand of God in history if we know where to look.